It was a busy afternoon near the Grand Royal Palace. The sun was shining brightly, and tourists, locals, and workers filled the streets. Among the crowd, a royal guard stood at attention. Dressed in his uniform, he was part of the strong tradition of the royal family's protection. He stood perfectly still, just like every royal guard before him. His stance was straight, his gaze unwavering. Every movement around him seemed to be happening in slow motion, but he remained unmoved, focusing on his duty. People passed by, taking pictures, whispering, and sometimes pointing at him. But nothing could distract him from his post. The royal guard had seen it all before. Tourists in awe, children asking to take pictures, even people trying to get his attention with jokes. He had learned to ignore everything. After all, this was his job, to stand watch, calm and steady, guarding the gates of the royal palace. He was part of history, part of something bigger than himself. But today, something was different. A man walked down the street with a dog on a leash. The man seemed out of place in the busy crowd. His shoulders were tense, and his expression showed signs of irritation. As he passed the guard, he stopped, looked him up and down, and scoffed. The royal guard could hear the man muttering under his breath, but he stayed still, not reacting in the slightest. The man, now standing just a few feet away from the guard, seemed to grow even more upset. His voice became louder as he started to mock the guard. "What's this, huh? Just standing there all day long, looking like a statue," he said, his tone full of sarcasm. The guard did not respond. His eyes were focused ahead, his face calm, and his body unmoving. The man clearly didn't like being ignored. He stepped closer to the guard, continuing with his harsh words. "Do they pay you to just stand there? Don't you get bored of doing nothing?" Still, the guard remained silent, his eyes fixed ahead as though he hadn't heard a word. The man's dog, which had been quietly walking beside him, suddenly began to bark. The dog's loud barks echoed through the area. The man smiled, looking down at his dog, as if this was some kind of victory. "Get him, boy," he shouted. The dog, now barking fiercely, began to tug on the leash, excited by the tension in the air. The crowd around the guard began to notice what was happening. Some people stopped to watch, curious to see how the royal guard would handle the situation. The guard didn't flinch, not even a little. His expression didn't change. He had seen difficult situations before, and he knew that staying calm was the key. The man's anger was growing. He was determined to get a reaction from the guard. "What are you, a robot? Are you too afraid to move?" he taunted. He tugged on the leash, urging his dog to get closer to the guard. People nearby began to murmur, sensing something was about to happen. But still, the royal guard remained unbothered. His focus was unwavering, his body perfectly still. It was as if the world around him didn't exist. He had a job to do, and no matter what was thrown his way, he wouldn't let anything distract him from his duty. The dog kept barking, the man kept shouting, but the guard didn't react. The crowd around them was beginning to grow larger. Some people even started taking out their phones to record the unusual scene. What would happen next? Would the royal guard finally break his silence, or would he continue to stand firm? Everyone was waiting to see what the guard would do next. The tension in the air was thick, and that's when it happened. The man stood there, his eyes locked on the royal guard. He could feel his anger rising. The dog beside him was still barking loudly, and it seemed to sense its owner's growing frustration. The crowd around them had gotten even bigger, drawn in by the unusual scene. People were whispering and pointing, curious about what was going to happen next. Most of them probably expected the royal guard to finally react, but he hadn't moved a muscle. The man's patience was wearing thin. He had tried everything, his insults, his taunting, and now the dog's barking. But nothing was getting under the guard's skin. It was as if the guard was some kind of statue, completely immune to anything around him. Finally, the man could no longer hold back. His face reddened with frustration, and he stepped closer to the royal guard. "What's the matter with you?" he yelled. "Don't you have any pride? You just stand there looking like an idiot." His voice was getting louder, and the people nearby seemed to shift uncomfortably. They had probably never seen a royal guard disrespected in this way before. But the royal guard didn't even blink. His eyes remained forward, and his posture stayed perfect. It was clear that this man's words didn't faze him. The more the man yelled, the calmer the guard seemed to become. The tension in the air, however, was growing thicker. The man was now standing just a few feet away from the guard, practically spitting with anger. His dog, still tugging at the leash, seemed to sense the hostility and was barking even more loudly. The crowd was getting restless, some even asking each other what was happening. Some of them were recording the scene on their phones, as if they were witnessing something extraordinary. "Don't you get it?" the man said, shaking his head. "I bet you're just too scared to do anything. You think you're special because you wear that uniform, but you're nothing." His voice echoed through the street, and it felt as though the whole world was listening to him. But the guard remained still. His face was expressionless, his eyes still focused straight ahead. He had heard it all before. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to provoke him. He knew how to ignore such things and keep his composure. The man wasn't done, though. He took another step closer, now practically face to face with the royal guard. "What are you gonna do, huh? Just keep standing there?" He smirked, looking at the guard with a sense of superiority. The man clearly thought he had won. He was used to getting a reaction from people, especially when he was so angry. But the royal guard remained silent. By now, the dog was practically jumping at the guard, its barks getting louder and more frantic. The tension in the air was almost unbearable, and the crowd could feel it. People were holding their breath, waiting to see if the royal guard would finally break. But nothing happened. The royal guard stood firm, unshaken. And that's when the man did something that nobody expected. He stepped back, his eyes narrowing, and gave his dog one final command. "Go get him, boy." With that, the dog lunged forward, teeth bared, as if ready to attack. The crowd gasped. What would the guard do now? Would he finally react, or would he stay as calm as ever? The moment of truth had arrived. The dog, with its sharp teeth bared, charged toward the royal guard. Its barking grew louder, and the dog's eyes were filled with excitement as it neared its target. The crowd around them gasped, their attention fixed on what was happening. Everyone was waiting for the royal guard to make a move, to do something, anything, to stop the dog from getting closer. But the royal guard remained still. His body was perfectly still, his posture unbroken, and his eyes were still locked forward. The dog was getting closer, and its growls echoed in the air, but the guard didn't flinch. Not even a tiny movement, not even a shift in his gaze. The crowd was silent now. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. Was the royal guard really going to let the dog get any closer? Was he truly going to stand there and allow the dog to attack? Some people began to whisper to each other, unsure of what to make of it. Was this part of the royal guard's training? Was this how they were taught to respond to danger? Or was the guard simply too afraid to act? For a moment, it seemed as if time had stopped. The dog was just a few feet away from the royal guard now, and its barks were deafening. The tension in the air was thick, and the people around them waited in suspense, unsure of what would happen next. And then something remarkable happened. As the dog lunged toward the royal guard, the guard slowly extended his arm. It wasn't fast or sudden. It was a slow, deliberate movement, as if he had all the time in the world. His arm moved forward in a calm and controlled manner. His hand gently intercepted the dog's leap, stopping it in midair. The crowd was stunned. The dog, which had been so full of energy and aggression just moments ago, was now held in the royal guard's hand. The guard didn't seem bothered at all by the dog's frantic movements. His grip was firm, but not harsh. He wasn't trying to hurt the dog. He was simply stopping it from causing any harm. The dog, surprised by the sudden stop, paused for a moment. It looked up at the guard with wide eyes, its tail wagging slightly as if unsure of what had just happened. The guard, still calm and composed, held the dog for a few more seconds, making sure it was safely contained. Then he gently lowered the dog to the ground, keeping a firm grip on the leash. The crowd watched in awe. They had expected a violent confrontation, something dramatic. But instead, they had witnessed something much more surprising: control, discipline, and calmness. The man, who had been watching eagerly as the dog attacked, was now completely stunned. He stood there, his mouth slightly open, unable to understand how the guard had managed to handle the situation so effortlessly. His anger was replaced by confusion. What had just happened? How had the royal guard stopped the dog so easily without hurting it or reacting aggressively? The royal guard's expression had not changed. He still stood tall and proud, his posture perfect as ever. His focus was unwavering, and his face remained calm. It was as if he had simply done his job, nothing more and nothing less. The people around him were quiet for a moment, processing what they had just witnessed. Some of them began to whisper in amazement. Others started to record the scene, realizing they had just seen something incredible. The royal guard, still holding the dog by the leash, looked up at the man. He didn't say a word, but his gaze was clear. It was the look of someone who had everything under control. And with that, the situation seemed to be over. But the man, still in shock, wasn't sure what to do next. Would he back down? Would he leave? Or would he try something else? Everyone was waiting for his next move. The dog, still held firmly by the royal guard, began to wriggle and pull on the leash. Its barks echoed in the air, louder now than ever before. It clearly wanted to keep going, to finish what it had started. The man stood there, shocked by the guard's unexpected calmness, but his anger wasn't over yet. He could feel the heat of frustration rising again, and the pressure of the crowd's gaze on him. The guard, still holding the dog firmly, didn't seem to care about the people around them. He was focused on the task at hand, calmly preventing the dog from causing any harm. His grip on the leash didn't tighten, but his hold was strong, and the dog could no longer move forward. The guard's movements were slow and deliberate, as if he had practiced this exact situation 1,000 times before. His focus was as sharp as ever, and his face still showed no emotion. The man took a few steps back, watching his dog being controlled in such a calm and unshakable way. His chest heaved as he breathed in deep breaths, his mind racing with thoughts. He had tried to push the guard into action, expecting to see anger or a reaction. But instead, he had seen nothing but calm control. He felt a rush of frustration, but this time it wasn't just because of the guard. It was because his plan had failed. He had hoped for a fight, for a reaction, but the guard wasn't giving him what he wanted. The crowd, sensing that something unexpected was happening, had grown quiet. People had stopped talking, their attention fully focused on the scene unfolding before them. Some people had begun to take out their phones, wanting to capture the rare moment. Others simply watched, waiting to see if the situation would escalate. The man shifted his weight from one foot to the other, trying to find a way to regain control of the situation. He glanced at the dog, which was now standing still, looking up at the guard in confusion. The dog had stopped barking, and its tail no longer wagged aggressively. It was as if it didn't know what to make of the calm guard holding it. "Get off me," the man finally yelled, his voice breaking through the silence. "That's my dog. What do you think you're doing? Let him go." But the royal guard remained silent. He didn't move. He didn't speak. His focus was unshakable. He had not been given an order to release the dog, and until then, he was not going to budge. His eyes never left the dog as he gently held the leash, keeping the animal from getting any closer. The man, now embarrassed, paced back and forth. His mind raced with thoughts of what he could do next. His earlier bravado was starting to slip away. He had underestimated the guard's ability to remain calm and composed under pressure. The dog, meanwhile, had calmed down as well. Its barks had stopped, and it was now standing quietly in the guard's grip, as if waiting to be let go. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man's frustration began to fade. His shoulders slumped slightly, and he let out a heavy sigh. He could feel the eyes of the crowd still watching him, waiting for him to make a move. He didn't want to look weak, but the truth was, he had no idea what to do next. The guard had completely neutralized the situation with a calmness that the man couldn't match. The royal guard, still holding the dog, glanced up at the man. The look in his eyes was clear, calm, confident, and in control. He had handled the situation without aggression, and now it was time to move forward. The man stood there for a moment, realizing he had lost. He didn't want to admit it, but there was no other option. He finally took a deep breath and looked down at his dog, who was still standing quietly by the guard's side. "Fine," the man muttered under his breath. "I'll take him." And with that, the tension slowly began to ease, but the crowd was still buzzing with amazement at how calmly the royal guard had handled the entire situation. The man stood there, his shoulders slumped and his face flushed with embarrassment. His earlier anger had fizzled out, replaced by a mixture of confusion and defeat. He had expected a confrontation, a dramatic response from the royal guard, but instead, he had been met with nothing but calm and control. He could hardly believe it. He had tried to provoke the guard, to get him to react, but it hadn't worked. The royal guard, still holding the leash with a firm but gentle grip, looked down at the dog. The dog had finally stopped struggling and was now standing quietly at the guard's feet. The guard's expression remained unchanged, his face a mask of professionalism. He didn't show any sign of triumph, nor did he seem bothered by the scene that had just unfolded. To him, this was just another part of his duty, one that he had handled with remarkable calmness. The crowd, which had been watching in silence, began to murmur among themselves. Some were still in awe of how the guard had managed to stay so calm. Others were shocked by how easily the situation had been resolved. A few people had even started to clap, impressed by the royal guard's unshakable composure. The man, realizing he had lost control of the situation, muttered something under his breath, though his words were barely audible. He glanced down at his dog, who was now behaving in a much calmer manner, and then back at the royal guard. The tension that had once filled the air had all but disappeared. The guard had done his job perfectly, without any unnecessary drama. "All right," the man said, his voice quieter now. "You can let him go." Without saying a word, the royal guard gently released the leash, allowing the dog to walk back to its owner. The dog, having calmed down, trotted over to its owner and stood beside him, still a little unsure but no longer aggressive. The man, still unsure of what had just happened, reached down and grabbed the leash again, but this time his hands were less sure, his grip less firm than before. It was as if the entire experience had shaken his confidence. The royal guard did not move. He remained in his position, standing tall and silent, his face still as impassive as ever. He had done what was necessary to keep the peace, and now his work was done. It was clear that nothing would disrupt his focus or his duty. The people who had been watching were still in awe of his professionalism. For a moment, the man and the royal guard stood facing each other. The man was still processing the situation, unsure of how to react. The guard, on the other hand, showed no signs of any emotion, as if this were just another ordinary day on his post. It was this calmness, this unshakable poise, that had completely thrown the man off. He had expected the guard to get angry, to make a mistake, to act out of frustration. But instead, he had seen a level of self-control that he had never expected. The man finally broke the silence. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice quieter than before. "I shouldn't have done that." The royal guard didn't respond. He simply nodded, acknowledging the man's apology without a word. There was no need for further discussion. The man had been defeated, not by force, but by the guard's incredible composure. With the tension now completely gone, the crowd began to disperse, some of them still talking about what they had just witnessed. The man, still holding his dog's leash, turned and walked away, his head down in thought. He had come looking for a fight, but instead he had learned something far more powerful. True strength didn't come from anger or aggression. It came from staying calm and in control, no matter what happened. And as for the royal guard, he stood silently, ready to face whatever came next, his duty always his top priority. The moment had passed, but the lesson from it would stay with everyone who had witnessed it. The royal guard stood tall and unwavering, his posture perfect, as the crowd slowly began to move away. Some people exchanged quiet comments, still in shock over what they had just witnessed. It wasn't every day that you saw a royal guard faced with such aggression, only to handle it with such calm and control. Many had expected an intense reaction, but instead they had seen something entirely different: grace under pressure. The man, still holding the leash, turned and walked away, his dog now by his side, walking at a much slower pace. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him as he passed, and it made him uncomfortable. He had hoped for a scene, a dramatic confrontation, but what had unfolded before him was far from what he had imagined. As he walked, the anger that had once filled him began to fade, replaced by something else: embarrassment. He couldn't believe that he had actually tried to provoke the royal guard. All he had wanted was a reaction, any reaction. But now, as he reflected on what had happened, he couldn't deny it. The guard had won, not through force, but through something much more powerful: self-control. The man's footsteps slowed as he thought about the guard's actions. He had expected to see someone who would be angered by the insults, someone who would lash out, but instead he had witnessed something far more impressive. The guard had remained calm, focused, and unbothered by anything the man had thrown at him. In a way that was more powerful than any show of strength or aggression. The man stopped walking for a moment, glancing back toward the royal guard, who had already returned to his post. The guard stood as still as ever, his eyes forward, his stance perfect. It was as if nothing had happened at all. The man couldn't help but feel a sense of respect for the guard now. He had been trying to get under the guard's skin, but instead, the guard had remained unaffected. He let out a long sigh, feeling the weight of his actions. The anger that had fueled him earlier was now gone, replaced by a sense of shame. He had been the one in the wrong, and now it was clear to him. The royal guard hadn't needed to do anything dramatic to prove his point. His calmness alone had been enough. The crowd had mostly disappeared by now, leaving only a few stragglers who were still talking about what had happened. The man, with his dog still walking at his side, turned and began to make his way down the street, his thoughts still focused on the guard. The royal guard's presence had made him realize something important. There was strength in staying calm, in not allowing anger or frustration to control you. He couldn't help but feel a bit of admiration for the guard now. The guard had faced an attack, both verbal and physical, but had handled it with such poise and dignity. The man wondered if he could ever learn to be as composed as the royal guard. It wasn't just about being strong. It was about having the power to remain in control, no matter what. As the man walked further away, his mind started to clear. The tension from the encounter began to fade. He had come looking for a confrontation, but what he had found instead was a lesson. It was a lesson he would remember for a long time: the power of staying calm in the face of provocation. Meanwhile, the royal guard continued to stand tall and steady, performing his duties as if nothing had happened, his calm presence a silent reminder of the strength that came from within. The man may have walked away, but the guard's example would stay with him for a long time. The man kept walking, his dog at his side, but his mind was racing. The strange encounter with the royal guard had left him shaken. He had expected to feel victorious, to see the guard react to his insults and provocation. Instead, the guard had remained still, calm, and controlled, and the situation had ended without any drama. The more the man thought about it, the more he realized how foolish he had been. He had tried to provoke the guard, to get under his skin, but instead of anger or frustration, he had been met with an impenetrable calm. The man felt embarrassed as he recalled how he had shouted at the guard, calling him names and challenging him. But the guard had shown him that sometimes the best response is no response at all. As the man walked away from the scene, he heard a voice calling out to him. It was a quiet voice, but it carried through the street with a tone of authority. "Excuse me," the voice said, and the man stopped in his tracks. He turned around, surprised to see the royal guard walking toward him. The guard's posture was still perfect, his expression unchanged, and his calm demeanor was as steady as ever. The man wasn't sure what to expect now, but he felt a sense of unease creeping up on him. Was the guard going to scold him? Was he about to face some kind of punishment for his actions? But to the man's surprise, the guard didn't seem angry at all. He walked slowly toward him, his eyes never leaving the man's face. When he finally stood a few feet away, the guard spoke again, his voice calm and clear. "I understand that you may have been frustrated," the guard said, his tone steady but not unkind. "But there is no need for violence or anger. The world doesn't work through force, but through understanding and self-control." The man felt a jolt of surprise at the guard's words. He had expected the guard to be angry, to demand an apology, or even to lecture him harshly. But instead, the guard's words were thoughtful and measured. There was no trace of resentment or hostility in his voice. It was as if the guard was trying to explain something important without scolding him. "I didn't want any trouble," the man muttered, suddenly feeling small. I thought it would be funny or something." The royal guard nodded slowly, acknowledging the man's words. It is not unusual to feel frustration, especially when we face things that seem unfair or difficult. But responding with anger rarely brings the result we expect. The man stood there, listening to the guard's words, and for the first time, he felt something different: guilt. He had tried to make the guard lose his composure, to make him react. But instead, the guard had shown him a lesson in patience, restraint, and respect. "I'm sorry," the man said quietly, almost to himself. He wasn't just apologizing for what he had done to the guard. He was apologizing for his own behavior, his need to cause a scene, and to make someone else react. He hadn't realized it before, but now, looking at the royal guard's calm face, he understood. Anger wasn't the answer. Strength wasn't about provoking others. It was about controlling oneself. The royal guard gave him a small nod, as if accepting the apology without needing words. "It is done," the guard said softly. "The past cannot be changed. But you have the choice to move forward differently." The man stood there, feeling a weight lifted from his shoulders. He had expected the guard to react with anger, but instead, the royal guard had taught him something far more valuable: how to remain calm in the face of provocation, and how to understand that true strength comes from within. The man took a deep breath, nodded back at the royal guard, and began walking away once more, this time with a new sense of awareness. He would remember this lesson, and hopefully, it would change the way he saw things in the future. As the man walked away from the royal guard, a quiet sense of reflection settled over him. His footsteps, once filled with anger and frustration, now seemed slower and more thoughtful. The guard's words echoed in his mind, and the man couldn't help but think about how his entire approach had been wrong. He had walked into the situation seeking conflict, trying to provoke a reaction. But in the end, the royal guard had shown him the power of calmness, patience, and self-control. The man's dog, walking beside him, seemed to sense the change too. The dog was now walking calmly at his side, no longer tugging at the leash or barking at every little thing. It was almost as if the tension in the air had cleared for both of them. The man glanced down at the dog, who was now walking with its head held high, a sign of respect for the quiet peace that had settled over them both. The man's mind wandered back to the scene with the royal guard. The calmness of the guard had been remarkable, and the man realized that it wasn't just the guard's job to stay calm. It was his way of life. The royal guard wasn't just standing there to protect the palace. He was standing as a symbol of strength, not through force or violence, but through discipline and inner peace. The guard's unshaken composure had given him something to think about, something far more valuable than a quick, angry reaction. The more the man thought about it, the more he realized that this moment had changed him. He had expected the guard to react with anger, to lash out, but instead, the guard had shown him that true strength was not in lashing out. It was in staying calm, in being the bigger person when everyone else might have lost their temper. As the man continued walking, his pace slowed even further. His mind was clearer now, and his feelings of guilt were slowly being replaced with a desire to be better, to be more like the royal guard. He had acted out of frustration and anger, but the guard had acted with grace, and that was something the man could learn from. He walked past a park bench where a few people were sitting, chatting quietly. One of them, a young woman, smiled at him as he passed. She had no idea what had just happened, but for the first time that day, the man felt different. He nodded to her in return, not with the frustration he had felt earlier, but with a small, genuine smile. It was a smile of understanding, of realizing that life wasn't about picking fights, it was about choosing peace. The man finally reached the corner of the street where he could no longer see the royal guard. But even though the encounter was over, the lesson remained with him. He had walked into the situation expecting to win, but instead, he had left with something far more valuable. The knowledge that remaining calm in the face of provocation was the true sign of strength. He took a deep breath, and for the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. He wasn't angry anymore, and he realized that he didn't need to be. The world had its challenges, but it was how you chose to face them that mattered. The royal guard had shown him that sometimes the best way to deal with frustration wasn't by fighting back. It was by staying calm, letting go of anger, and showing respect to everyone around you. As the man walked further down the street, he felt a sense of clarity. Maybe, just maybe, he could change. He could start looking at the world differently, and the royal guard's example would be his guide. The man continued walking, his steps light and steady, but his thoughts were deep. He hadn't expected his day to turn out this way. What had started as an angry outburst, a moment of frustration directed at the royal guard, had become a turning point in his life. He couldn't shake off the guard's calm demeanor and the powerful lesson he had learned. The world around him seemed quieter now. The bustling streets, the noise of people walking by, all of it felt less overwhelming. The anger and frustration that had weighed so heavily on him earlier had disappeared, replaced by a sense of peace. It was as if the encounter had cleared the air, both for him and the people who had watched. He passed by the same park bench where the young woman had smiled at him earlier. This time, he returned her smile with a genuine one of his own. There was no tension in his chest now, no rush to get away or to prove a point. He was simply existing in the moment, enjoying the peacefulness that had taken over him. As he walked further, he noticed more people, tourists, families, locals, going about their day. But something about it seemed different now. The man wasn't focused on his own thoughts or frustrations anymore. He was present, observing the world with a new clarity. The calmness that the royal guard had displayed was starting to settle in his own mind. It wasn't that the man didn't still face challenges or frustrations. It was that now, he understood how to handle them differently. The guard had shown him the power of silence, of not reacting to provocation with more anger, but with control. The man didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. He didn't need to fight or argue. By staying calm and composed, he could navigate the world with confidence, without feeling the need to react aggressively. His dog, still walking at his side, seemed to mirror his newfound calmness. The dog had been just as agitated and loud as its owner earlier in the day, but now, both of them walked quietly, side by side, moving in harmony. The man looked down at the dog and smiled softly. It was as if they were both learning together, growing from the experience. The man passed by the crowd once more, But this time, he didn't feel self-conscious. He wasn't worried about how he looked or what others might think of him. He had learned that sometimes the best thing to do was to simply walk away from a situation, to let it go, and to move forward with a sense of peace. As he neared the corner of the street, the man stopped. He glanced back in the direction where the royal guard still stood, his post unchanged. The guard's presence, though distant, had made an impact that would stay with him forever. In that moment, the man realized something important. He didn't need to seek validation from others. He didn't need to win every argument or prove his strength through conflict. True strength came from within, from choosing peace over anger, and from being in control of one's emotions. The royal guard had shown him that. With a deep breath, the man continued his walk, his mind clear, his heart lighter. He was no longer the same person who had started the day full of frustration and anger. The guard had helped him realize that true strength wasn't about how loud you could be or how strong you could act. It was about staying calm, focused, and respectful, no matter what life threw at you. And with that, the man walked on, his heart full of quiet confidence, ready to face whatever the world would bring, knowing that he had the power to remain calm, no matter the circumstances.